the work has continued looking at insulin, its effects pathogenically or harmfully on the body, and also other things that insulin influences, like the production of ketones and how ketones act as their own signaling molecules, and not just as a nutrient source, but actually telling cells to do something. And just to state that another way, because it is unique, where these are not just nutrients. Ketones have a caloric value similar to about glucose, actually, but they also have signaling that is very unique. They almost act like a hormone. Now, they're not, but they kind of act like it. Too many people don't realize that hyperinsulinemia is a fundamental aspect of insulin resistance, that they'll hear me or you or anyone else talk about insulin resistance, and that immediately evokes this idea of it's a state in the body where the hormone insulin isn't working well. That's true, but it doesn't stop there. Insulin resistance is a coin. And one side of the coin is the fact that the hormone insulin isn't working the same way that it used to at some cells of the body. In other words, some of the body's cells are in fact insulin resistant, like muscle cells or fat cells, but other cells of the body are perfectly insulin sensitive or have some mix of insulin sensitivity, like liver cells or gonads, like ovaries in particular. And that all becomes relevant when we flip the coin over. This coin that I'm calling insulin resistance. The other side of the coin is the hyperinsulinemia. There is no such thing as insulin resistance without hyperinsulinemia. That's very important because there are some instances called physiological insulin resistance, where the body has become insulin resistant to serve a valuable purpose. And overwhelmingly, that's growth. And that's why you only have physiological insulin resistance in two situations, pregnancy and puberty, because those are the two periods of rampant growth in a human, in the adolescent or in the adult female, of course. But even still, it's rampant growth, and the insulin resistance and the connected hyperinsulinemia help to fuel this selective growth in the adolescent or the pregnant woman. But regardless, whether it's harmful insulin resistance, like I study in my lab, the kind that's connected to Alzheimer's, et cetera, or whether it's physiological insulin resistance, when the body's become insulin resistant for a period of time on purpose, it still is both of these aspects. Its insulin is altered in how it's working, and blood insulin levels are elevated. In other words, hyperinsulinemia. And a perfect example of this, it's to look at the two most common forms of infertility in males and females. Specifically, I mean erectile dysfunction and polycystic ovary syndrome, respectively. And in erectile dysfunction, it's a problem of the insulin resistance part of this coin, side of the coin, which is that insulin isn't able to promote sufficient vasodilation in the man anymore. And so not only does he have probably elevated blood pressure, but if you can't dilate blood vessels, you don't have normal erectile function. And thus it's the insulin resistance that's contributing to the male form of infertility, the most common. In stark contrast, in the female, it's not the problem of compromised insulin signaling. It's more a problem of the hyperinsulinemia, because at her ovaries, she has cells in her ovaries that are capable of rapidly converting testosterone into estrogens. And that's a little known fact. All estrogens were once testosterone, and the ovaries convert that over very, very well at a much higher rate than the testes do in men. However, insulin inhibits that conversion. And so as she's insulin resistant and her insulin levels are higher, that has a specific effect at the ovaries, where it's the elevated insulin, not the insulin resistance per se, that is preventing her ovaries from converting the testosterone into estrogens at a high enough amount. Now her testosterone's too high, her estrogens are too low, and then she has polycystic ovary syndrome. She isn't ovulating, she may have more coarse body hair, and so on.
Would you be able to snap back into it if you needed to?
Within a day,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Perfect, yeah.
All it takes is one challenge to the beta cells, and then they say, okay, we're doing this again. No problem, I can do that. Insulin tends to have, when insulin is working, it has a vasodilatory effect. It's one of insulin's lesser known actions, but it's just further proof that insulin literally affects every part of the body. Every single cell of the body has insulin receptors, which really makes it really unique among hormones, because not all hormones, in fact, few hormones do that. But one of insulin's effects is when it binds the cells of the blood vessel, it will induce the production of a molecule called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide, I'm sure your audience knows, it's a potent vasodilator. That's basically what, if someone's experiencing chest pain, they go in and they give them nitroglycerin. It's because the nitroglycerin will help stimulate this nitric oxide throughout the body, and it will throw open the blood vessels, for example, of the heart, and then the chest pain goes away. But to another degree, that's what's happening around the body. But in the case of the insulin resistant man, when his blood vessels have become insulin resistant, well, that's not working as well. And so insulin's trying to promote vasodilation, it can't, and the blood vessels stay constricted. Now, systemically throughout the body, as the vessels are more constricted, the narrower that volume is, of course, the higher the pressure goes. Those are inversely related. As volume's dropping in the chamber of the blood vessel, it's pressing in on the blood more, which increases pressure. But then, of course, when it comes to erection, if you can't dilate the blood vessels and they stay constricted, now you have a compromised erectile function. Scientists have suggested, and physicians, that erectile dysfunction may be the first clinical sign of insulin resistance in an otherwise undiagnosed man. It might be worth testing his metabolic health, namely his insulin and insulin resistance, to get an idea of whether that might be the source of the problem. And if it is, well, that's good news, because we can start to fix that pretty quickly.
Doctors I know don't commonly look at that. They often will look at that as a sign of low testosterone.
I know. One group found that ketones actually will bind to cells and inhibit something called the NLRP3 inflammasome. Ome as a suffix just generally refers to like a sum, like the entirety of whatever it is you're looking at. And so the inflammasome essentially evokes this idea of something that is in charge of all inflammation. And that's not too far from the truth, where this molecule NLRP3, essentially, if it's activated, it will essentially turn on all of the machinery to produce all of these pro-inflammatory cytokines and initiate immune systems throughout the body. Now, of course, we need a healthy immune system, so this can't be viewed as a bad thing. But you want it to be turned on when it's supposed to be turned on and turned off when it should be turned off. One of the problems with obesity, or even not overt obesity, but just fat cells that are getting too big, even if the person's just modestly overweight, is that they become pro-inflammatory. And this is why weight gain is associated with it's sometimes called a subclinical inflammatory state, where it's subclinical because it's not like the person's coming in with some raging fever, but in fact, the inflammatory markers are higher than you would expect in an otherwise healthy person. So in these instances where you have kind of aberrant activation of the immune system and inflammation, it's valuable to know, how can we turn that down? How can we turn down this aberrant inflammation? And ketones will do that. And this isn't because of their caloric value. It's because they can bind to these things called G protein coupled receptors, because they are everywhere and they signal all kinds of things. But there are so many different types that ketones will bind a particular type, and in so doing, act like a hormone, binding this surface receptor, just like a hormone does, initiating a series of events that result in the inhibition of this key inflammatory signal. We've specifically looked at the signaling capability in fat cells, and we found that when ketones come to fat cells, including fat cells in humans, that it starts to activate an uncoupling process at the mitochondria. Now, briefly, all that means is basically the ketones result in the mitochondria in fat cells being much more active. It basically stimulates the metabolic rate in the fat cells by about 2 or 3 times over normal. And again, that's not because the ketones being burned for energy. It's because there, once again, is a G protein coupled receptor on the fat cell that is activated when ketones come knocking, and then that tells the cell to do something. That yes, ketones are an energy. That's why, the brain so greedily pulls in ketones, because it has an energetic value. It has a caloric value roughly similar to glucose, about 4 calories per gram. But independent of that is its signaling capabilities, where these are molecules that, again, are an energy source, maybe desperate for the brain, or the brain becomes desperate for it. So it's a very good, viable energy source, but also a good and viable signaling molecule that provides an anti-inflammatory and even, dare I say, metabolic benefit. It was basically helping people understand the fact that they need not be afraid of any modest increase in insulin that comes from dietary protein, because if it happens in the context of a low carb diet, then the commensurate increase in insulin's opposite is glucagon, namely, is greater than or equal to what the change in insulin is. And that matters. So in other words, if you eat some protein and you're eating it with carbohydrate, which in nature never happens, never. In nature, protein comes with fat. It doesn't come with carbs. If you eat your protein with glucose, then you get a big increase in insulin, bigger than it would have been if it was just glucose alone. So no question, the protein adds to the insulinogenic effect of a carbohydrate. But also, they're not supposed to come together. If you eat the protein with the fat and there's no carb, well, then there may be a modest insulin increase, but there's a relatively greater glucagon increase. And glucagon is insulin's opposite in many, many ways, including ketogenesis. So whereas that little elevation in insulin is trying to inhibit the production of ketones, that relatively greater increase in glucagon is overcoming that, and in fact, acting more as a stimulatory effect. So offsetting the modest increase in insulin. So to wrap all of that up, my concluding thought is, for the average individual who's focusing on just improving their health, no reason to fear protein, but be smart about it. Don't eat your protein with carbs, because you will in fact amplify that insulin effect. Let the protein come with the fat that it wants to come with in nature. And if you're adding anything to it, let it be that you're adding a little olive oil or a little butter or whatever, not carbs. Rather, add a little fat if you need to, because that fat will not increase insulin. We're doing macronutrient challenges, and you have to eat hundreds and hundreds of calories of pure fat before you're going to notice an insulin effect. If it's in the realm of even like 300 calories, which is still pretty significant, that's the range we're using, not a single blip. The insulin and the C-peptide don't budge at all. But anyway, to bring this back to your original question, no reason to fear protein. That is how we're supposed to eat fat. In nature, those two come together, and let's just eat them the way God intended, if you will. Because when you're fasting, the brain is producing ketones are providing about 70% of all of the brain's energy. And so its glucose need is very, very low, which is good, because if you're not eating anything, you're going to, especially carbs, well, then it's nice that the brain's glucose demand has gone down. Once you start running out of fat, your production of ketones plummet. And now the brain can't get any ketones and has now become totally dependent on glucose. And guess who has to start paying that? Well, it's muscle. And so now you start stripping the amino acids from the muscle in order to make all of this glucose for the brain to eat. So the irony is, they say, well, ketones, it's like you're tricking your body into starvation. In fact, ironically, having ketones means you're not in starvation. You're fasting. That's the difference between a fast and starvation. Do you have enough fat to make ketones to fuel the brain? Then it's a fast. Even if it's a 380-day fast, like that fellow did in Scotland or Ireland or Wales, I think it was Wales actually, a documented fast of over a year. He, of course, was morbidly obese. It was under medical supervision with water, minerals, vitamins, etc. But the fact that he kept making ketones meant he didn't lose any muscle. And indeed, he didn't, because you don't cut muscle unless you're starving. And starvation happens when you run out of fat and you can't make ketones. I just got back from a meeting where I presented at a science meeting, and it was the meeting of the American Association of Biological Anthropologists. And I felt compelled to remind or inform the person reaching out to me, I am not an anthropologist. I didn't add that I'm glad I wasn't, but I just felt compelled. Look, I'm a nutrient biochemist, mitochondrial physiologist. What do I have to say? And he had said, I'm familiar with your work on brain energy use. And in that article, I found it was all about how the Neanderthal diet and the development of the brain. And they had two comments in there, both of which reflected a profound ignorance by stating that dietary carbohydrates are essential and were essential to our ancestors in the development of their brain. And I actually cited that article, and then I just kind of hopefully tactfully just said, this is wrong. and then shared with them a quote by the National Academy of Sciences in the US stating that the lower limit of carbohydrates in the human diet is 0.
Yeah.
In other words, there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. And the idea that the human brain evolved because our ancestors ate a lot of carbs, that's utterly ridiculous. And that's basically the impression I gave the audience, hopefully not too offensively. But I had many, many people come up to me afterwards, very, very grateful. Maybe the haters and the detractors didn't bother coming up, but no one uttered a negative word. It was just absolute gratitude at learning this reality of human biology and physiology, which is that, yes, it's because they mistake dietary carbohydrates with blood glucose. That it appears, what does appear to be the case is that the brain has some demand for some glucose. That appears to be accurate, although the lower limit is unknown. Early work by a fasting physiologist named George Cahill, he was putting people's glucose down to like 20 milligrams per deciliter, which most people would say you're unconscious, you're in a coma and you're going to die. And these people, because they've been long-term fast adapted, which I would say ketone adapted, there appeared to be no deficit to cognition. I mean, that's a pretty bloody low level of glucose. But nevertheless, let's kind of grant that side of it, that the brain has some requirement for some glucose. Well, it is a minimal requirement, because if you take a body that has 5 millimolar glucose and you start increasing the ketones to 1 or 2 or even 3 millimolar, which is still less than the 5 millimolar of glucose, so there's still less of the ketone in the blood than there is the glucose, by then the brain has already dramatically shifted its energy use. And even though the ketone may be less than half of what the glucose is in the blood, it's now providing double, twice as much of energy to the brain as the glucose is. So if the brain has any preferential fuel, it is absolutely for the ketone. You can take a newborn baby and the baby can breastfeed or bottle feed. And then within an hour, the baby is in a deeper state of ketosis than an adult would be after fasting for a full day. I mean, that baby will be at 2 millimolar ketones in an hour. And an adult, and for me, if I want to get to 2 million, I got to fast for like 36 hours to get to that point. It is clearly that a natural state is a state of ketosis. And I think even more, it's reflected in humans. We are such totally unique creatures where we are the only land-based mammals born obese and the only animal who has a brain that is larger than the birth canal, much to mother's chagrin. But that means we have these very big, hungry brains and all of this chubby, adorable baby fat that is just producing ketones like gangbusters to fuel the brain growth. And if you have a baby that is born premature and lacks sufficient adipose tissue, it is much more likely that they're going to develop neurological disorders. All the more reason to chubby up that baby as quickly as you can. When someone's getting to elite level competition, I think that I can see the justification for using carbohydrates in performance, like Zach Bitter, that incredible runner. I believe he will train and live essentially 0 carb, but when he's really performing and during high intensity training, he will use carbs. And in his words, it's just a rocket fuel. It's like an extra fuel. So I do think for those who engage in very high intensity activity, I could be easily convinced that there is a value to dietary carbohydrates, even in the low carb adapted athlete. But I know many, especially endurance athletes, who don't flirt with that kind of stuff at all. And even in the midst of their Ironman, they're still all in full low carb keto and they do great. Yeah. I'm just saying I could be convinced. It wouldn't take a lot of evidence for me to say, yeah, that makes sense. Where if you're tossing in some glucose in the midst of it, you're going to use that glucose and you're going to use it greedily.
I essentially quintupled my caloric intake at that point because I was eating very small amount of lean muscle meat, and then a lot of greens, which don't have many calories in them. And I went to eating 2 to 3 pounds of fatty ribeye with butter melted on it a day. And so I was eating way more calories, and yet I dropped weight and I felt better. What are your thoughts on the whole calories in, calories out idea?
Yeah. So I think invoking thermodynamics in weight loss was one of the greatest tragedies of our understanding of human metabolism. And maybe even to say that another way, looking at nutrients as calorie sources, I think is unfortunate, because if we're looking at the calories, then we immediately develop a weight loss paradigm that is based on hunger. Imagine if I'm holding a buffet, a wonderful dinner at my home. It's a buffet, and I've invited the world's best chefs, and they're going to produce the best foods. They're going to make the best foods you could ever imagine. Come hungry. What would you do to come as hungry as possible? And always the consensus is two things. My students always say this. They would eat a little less in the days before, and they would exercise a little more. And I say, you're exactly right. That would help you come to this glorious buffet as hungry as possible. But do you see the problem with that? They just gave me this perfect two-step recipe to make hunger as strong as possible. That is the exact two things we've been saying for 50 years to help people lose weight. Yep, eat less, exercise more. That's a great way to be really hungry. And that means if you use those two same steps in order to lose weight, sure, you'll lose a little bit of weight initially, but hunger always wins, and you're going to get off and you're going to gain it all back and then some. You look at what happens at a fat cell and you say, I want to shrink that fat cell. You can shrink a fat cell through two different ways. I promise this is relevant. One is low energy. If you deprive a fat cell of nutrients, it will shrink. Now, of course, there's a problem at the body, namely the brain, and that is that it's going to start to get push hunger. Conversely, an alternative way of shrinking a fat cell is lowering insulin. Because if you lower insulin now, even if you're eating a lot, you can't stop the fat cell from breaking down its fat and leaking it out. So even if you're eating a lot and there's still fat coming in, it likely will not match the rate at which the fat is coming out in order to be burned. And even just purely caloric discussion, when insulin is low, metabolic rate is higher. So your metabolic rate does go up to the tune of about 300 calories per day. That's pretty significant. You know, that's like going out and running. I don't even know. I don't run 5 miles maybe. If you're focusing on a low insulin approach, it doesn't have to be a hunger-based approach, which is very valuable because you can't beat hunger. You got to be satisfied. Otherwise, you'll never stop eating. 2, when insulin is low, your metabolic rate is higher. So let's say you're eating more calories than your body needs. Well, that's okay because you're pushing out more calories than normal. And then 3rd, when you're making ketones, you're also excreting ketones. And as I said earlier, ketones have a caloric value. And so if someone's in ketosis and now they're breathing out ketones or urinating out ketones, they are pushing out actual caloric loaded molecules from their body. And these are calories that didn't need to be burned and didn't need to be stored. You just wasted them. So you introduce this kind of 3rd avenue when it comes to the bioenergetics of the body, which is just wasting energy, where you're just dumping ketones out back into the atmosphere, if you will. And those are actual calories that used to be stored in your fat that you didn't have to exercise harder in order to burn them in your muscle. You just dumped them from your body. That is how determined the body is to reconcile energy when insulin is low. It's just thinking, if insulin's low, the body is thinking, I got all this energy and I just don't need it. Insulin wants to store. So it will slow metabolic rate and it will promote tissue growth. And that's not a bad thing. We need to grow sometimes. You know, we need insulin. I'm not saying it's bad. We just don't want it to be high. And when it is high, we want it to be very quick. It's acute. It's up and then it's back down. Yeah, the classic view on Alzheimer's is that it was a disease of plaques accumulating in the brain. And that paradigm has started to fall out of favor insofar as we have a lot of drugs now that will reduce plaques and it doesn't help the disease. And we have evidence from humans, from cadavers, people who died with and without Alzheimer's disease, you know, people with no evidence of Alzheimer's disease, and they'll have a brain that has lots of plaques in it. In insulin resistance, the brain has become affected, and it can't use insulin well enough to open up the glucose transporters to fuel the brain, because glucose is a primary fuel. And some of that glucose uptake is dependent on insulin opening the glucose transporters. Well, you have a compromised glucose uptake, which means the brain starts to go hungry. And that matters because the brain has a very high metabolic rate. And if it can't get all its energy from glucose, now you have an energetic gap. That gap could be filled by ketones. However, in the same person who's insulin resistant and not able to use glucose very well, they don't have any ketones because they're hyperinsulinemic. They have elevated insulin. And as you said, and we've mentioned repeatedly, insulin inhibits ketogenesis. And so the brain is swimming in a sea of glucose that it can't use. It's calling out for this life raft in the form of ketones that insulin simply won't let the brain get. And thus, we're left with a hungry brain. And there's evidence in humans to show that if you start to fill that gap with ketones, giving a person like a ketone ester, you do improve their cognition. They do start to think better. And that to me is a bit of a win in a disease where there are never any wins. Yeah. And so my view on Alzheimer's is if you've already got it, if a loved one already has it, try to increase those ketones any way we can. If we want to keep it at bay, keep your brain insulin sensitive and give it some ketones from time to time. You know, for goodness sakes, let it have some ketones, which is a preferred fuel if there is any preferred fuel.